Open your medicine cabinet. Somewhere in there is probably a small plastic case, a pack of pills, or a box you barely think twice about. A few seconds of effort, and the decision of whether or not to have a child this month is entirely yours. But for over 99% of human history, that decision existed too. Women made it constantly, and they had no pills, no plastic, no doctors. Just plants, timing, and an understanding of their own bodies that modern medicine is only now starting to take seriously. So how did they do it? The answer isn't superstition, it's pharmacology, and some of it actually worked. Let's start with the plant that almost changed history and then vanished completely. On the North African coast, in the Greek colony of Cyrene, grew a plant called Silphium. For nearly 600 years, it was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient Mediterranean. Coins from Cyrene were stamped with its image. Roman writers described it as worth its weight in silver. And ancient texts, from Greek physicians to Roman naturalists, consistently described the same use. Taken regularly, it prevented pregnancy, and in higher doses, it could end one already in progress. By the 1st century AD, the plant was extinct, overharvested into non-existence, a victim of its own effectiveness. Modern botanists still aren't entirely sure what Silphium was. The closest surviving relatives, plants in the same genus, have been tested in modern labs. And here's what stopped researchers cold. Those relatives contain compounds that interfere with implantation in animal studies. The ancient claims weren't just folklore. They were describing a real biochemical effect on a plant so effective it hunted itself to extinction. But Silphium was rare and expensive. Most women across most of history needed something more accessible, and that's where things get genuinely surprising. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, for thousands of years, one of the most consistently documented contraceptive methods wasn't a plant at all. It was timing, paired with the body's own signal, breastfeeding. Extended, frequent breastfeeding suppresses ovulation by keeping prolactin levels elevated, a hormone that interferes with the reproductive cycle. Anthropologists studying populations with no access to modern contraception, communities in the Amazon and sub-Saharan Africa and pre-industrial Europe found the same pattern again and again. Women who breastfed on demand, day and night, for 2 to 3 years per child experienced months or years of natural infertility afterward. This wasn't an accident or a side effect women simply tolerated. Historical records show women in multiple cultures were explicitly aware of the connection and used prolonged nursing deliberately to space births. Demographers now call this lactational amenorrhea. And in populations without other contraception, it has historically prevented more pregnancies than any other single method combined. The body itself was the technology. Now here's where the methods become genuinely inventive, because some cultures didn't wait for the body to do the work. They intervened directly, with plants whose effects modern pharmacology has only recently confirmed. In ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BC, describes a mixture of acacia gum, dates, and honey inserted before intercourse. For decades, this was dismissed as ritual nonsense. Then chemists actually tested acacia gum. When it ferments, it produces lactic acid, a compound that is still used today as a spermicidal ingredient in some modern contraceptive gels. The Egyptians weren't performing a ritual. They had identified, through trial and observation over generations, a substance with genuine spermicidal properties, 3,500 years before anyone understood what sperm was. In ancient Greece and Rome, physicians like Soranus and Dioscorides wrote detailed medical texts listing dozens of plants believed to prevent or end pregnancy. Pennyroyal, rue, wild carrot seed, also called Queen Anne's lace, pomegranate rind. For centuries, historians treated these as a mixed bag of superstition and wishful thinking, but in the 1990s, researchers began testing them properly. Wild carrot seed, used for this exact purpose continuously from ancient Greece through to rural communities in India and the American South well into the 20th century, was shown in animal studies to interfere with implantation when taken in the days following intercourse. Pennyroyal contains a compound that does affect the uterus, though at doses dangerously close to toxic, which likely explains why historical texts consistently warn about its risks alongside its uses. These weren't random guesses, they were the surviving entries from an enormous, multi-generational experiment conducted by women, on women, with the failures simply not written down because the women who tried them and got it wrong often didn't survive to pass on the recipe. But plants were only half the picture. The other half was barrier methods, and some of the earliest evidence is almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. Ancient Egyptian texts describe inserting a mixture containing crocodile dung mixed with a fermenting paste before intercourse. For a long time, this was the go-to example of ancient ignorance, except dried dung, particularly from certain animals, is mildly acidic, and an acidic environment is hostile to sperm. Combined with the fermented base, which would have lowered pH further, the mixture functioned, crudely, as a spermicidal barrier. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't elegant. but the underlying chemistry creating an acidic barrier at the cervix is the exact same principle behind some modern spermicidal formulations. Elsewhere, the approach was more directly physical. In parts of the Pacific Islands, and recorded among some indigenous communities in the Americas, women used softened materials, sea sponges soaked in vinegar or citrus juice, wads of fibrous bark or wool, positioned to block the cervix. The vinegar and citrus weren't incidental. Both are acidic. Women across unconnected cultures, separated by oceans, with no contact with each other, had independently arrived at the same two-part solution: physical barrier plus acidic spermicide. Not because anyone told them the chemistry, because generation after generation, the methods that happened to work got passed down, and the ones that didn't. Then there's withdrawal, the oldest method referenced in written history, appearing in the Book of Genesis and in texts from ancient China, India, and the Islamic world. Modern attitudes treat it as a punchline, the method that doesn't work. But demographic historians studying pre-industrial Europe found something that complicates that picture considerably. In several European populations before 1800, birth rates dropped significantly in specific regions decades before any other contraceptive method became available, and historians have linked this directly to a cultural shift toward withdrawal as a deliberate, communicated strategy between couples. It wasn't reliable, failure rates were high, but used consistently across millions of couples over centuries, it measurably altered the birth rate of entire regions. It was crude. It was also, in aggregate, one of the most historically significant contraceptive practices ever used, simply because of how widely and how long it was practiced. And then there's the method that required the most precise body literacy of all, timing based on observation. Long before anyone understood hormones, or ovulation in a clinical sense, women across multiple cultures tracked cervical mucus changes, body temperature shifts, and cycle timing, passing this knowledge down as practical wisdom. In the 20th century, when scientists finally mapped the hormonal cycle in detail, they found that the timing windows described in centuries-old folk knowledge from rural Europe and elsewhere lined up closely with the actual fertile window. The biology had been correctly identified, observationally, without microscopes, without hormone tests, purely through generations of women comparing notes about their own bodies. What's remarkable isn't that some of these methods were crude, dangerous, or unreliable. Many were. Pennyroyal could be lethal in the wrong dose. The crocodile dung mixture probably caused infections as often as it prevented pregnancy. What's remarkable is how much of it worked, at least partially, and how that knowledge survived for thousands of years with no writing, no institutions, and often actively suppressed by the cultures that depended on it. This was medical science, conducted entirely outside the structures we now call medical science. Trial, observation, transmission, refinement, generation after generation, by women who left almost no names behind, working with what the world handed them. Plants, timing, acid, and each other. Go back to that medicine cabinet. The pill in there is the endpoint of a chain of knowledge that stretches back further than agriculture, further than writing, back to women in Cyrene harvesting a plant they would eventually harvest into extinction, to women in the Nile Delta fermenting acacia gum, to mothers nursing children for years, not just for nourishment, but because they understood, without ever being told, exactly what their bodies were doing. The science didn't start with a laboratory. It started with them.